Welcome to the Dirt Road Tourist, a podcast about overlanding where we focus on the places you find on the way to camp. I'm Ken, and we aren't overlanding to find the most difficult off-road trails. We're seeking out the delicious food, the people, the culture, and sometimes the oddities, the America that you can only find when you leave the interstates behind and get out into the country. We'll talk about gear, camping tips to make your life out here more comfortable, interesting places to see, and vehicles that get you out to the good stuff. Join Susan and I to hear what we discover next on this episode of the Dirt Road Tourist. Welcome everyone to episode 1 of the Dirt Road Tourist. Yet another overlanding podcast, I hear you saying. Ken, why would you want to throw another one onto the internet? Because there's so much content out there, and I do listen to quite a bit of overlanding content myself. What I've found over the past few years of listening to this is that a lot of the podcasts fall into two kind of broad categories. Not all of it, but a lot of it does. You have on the one end, you have the Rocklanders. These are the 4x4 bros that got into overlanding, but they were 4x4 guys before they got into overlanding. These are the dudes who are bolting $30,000 worth of equipment onto a $5,000 truck. They take it out on the weekends, beat the living tar out of it, and then they come back and hammer out the trail rash. On the other end of the spectrum, you get the expedition guys. These are ones with major corporate sponsors. They have 7-figure budgets and they're airlifting $500,000 worth of equipment into places that Nat Geo won't go to, and they're dodging leftist rebels for a couple of weeks, and they come out with some amazing content, and it's fun to listen to, and it might even be aspirational for some. But let's face it, most of us, we're not using our rigs that way. Most of us have to work for a living, and we're weekend warriors, maybe with a couple of extended trips thrown in throughout the year. But if you found me, you may be totally new to overlanding or thinking about getting into overlanding. You've watched some YouTube videos and you're confused about all the gear that's out there because everybody and their brother is trying to hawk overlanding gear to this very lucrative market. There's a lot of money to be made in it. Maybe you're a seasoned overlander who's trying to take a step back from some of the really hard trails so that you can get your family more engaged in the pastime. Or maybe you're just trying not to break so much stuff on your rig because four-wheeling can get expensive. And I know a couple of guys in this boat. So for my purposes, what's the definition of overlanding? Well, in a nutshell, it's vehicle-dependent travel. You could be on a trip from Manhattan up to Yonkers, and if you're staying in your vehicle and depending upon what you're carrying in your vehicle, folks, you're either homeless or you're overlanding. But as long as you're carrying all your necessities with you on the rig or on your vehicle, and you're taking a trip from point A to point B to point C, you're overland. So you might be wondering, is overlanding just glorified camping? Well, in some ways and in some instances, it's a difference without distinction. And there's a ton of gatekeeping out there. A lot of people will tell you unless you're out in the middle of the wilderness, bro, and you're bouncing down a Class 5 trail headed towards a campsite that is in the total wilderness and hasn't been stood on since the dawn of time, you're not overlanding. That's not real overlanding. Well, I think that's far too narrow of a definition for what we do. If I'm thinking about camping, in my mind, I usually think of that as going to a place, you set up camp, and then you break camp and go home. There's no journey, and frequently that's what a weekend overlanding trip looks like. We don't have time to actually build a long route into a weekend where you go from point to point to point and camp in between them. You're usually having to go out, find a place that you've either seen on the internet or a place that you know of, and you're going to go out, drive a couple of trails to get to that place, set up camp, and then you're going to head back home. So is that camping or is that overlanding? Well, it's sometimes the time constraints that we're in, just being able to do a weekend trip, that's kind of what you're left with the ability to do. But if you're exploring from point A to point B and you're staying independently in your vehicle along the route, in my book, you're overlanding. So, what's the tourist in Dirt Road Tourist? Why did I choose that name for my podcast? Well, The reason behind that is because my focus is on travel. And whenever you think of travel, you think about when you're a kid, summer vacations, the folks would pick out a destination like the Grand Canyon or the Washington Monument. We're going to go see this. So you pile into the car, you hop onto a freeway, and you go see this, and then you hop back on the freeway and drive back home after it's done. And all you really are going to see on the way to this place and back are billboards. You're bypassing all of the really interesting stuff that might be along the way between where you live and where you were going. With overlanding, the destination is only half the draw of the trip, at least to me. There's so many things to discover along the way, and it can be whatever interests you. Maybe you're into cafes and restaurants, you're looking for the mom and pop place that has been serving the state's best fried chicken for 70 years, and it's a legend in the area. These are the kinds of things that you find along some of these back roads and byways. Maybe you're into wineries. Wineries are usually out there in the places that we go overlanding and camping. Breweries, distilleries, these are all can be strung together into a great week long trip. Maybe you're into historic sites like Civil War battlefields and you're trying to get around to see all of those. Well, you can string a number of those together into a great weekend or week long trip. Festivals, be it music festivals, garlic festival, the horseradish festival, whatever lights up your world. These are a great excuse to load up the rig and get out there. But when we're getting to some of these places off of Forest Service roads, you'll find trailheads frequently that you can hike down and get to waterfalls and these amazing scenic views. So there's a lot to be able to discover on the journey to get to wherever it is that you've picked that you're going. And it's not just where you go, but how you get there. And it doesn't have to be off-road trails. You don't have to be bouncing over boulders in your lifted 4x4 vehicle. There are scenic routes. The Blue Ridge Parkway would be a great example of one. It runs all the way up the East Coast here in the U.S. You've got county roads, the little smaller kind of the backcountry paved county roads, and even the 4x4 bro type guys. They spend a fair amount of time on these, particularly here on the East Coast, because they have to connect a series of trails together in order to be able to get a route for a longer trip. You've got Forest Service roads, and there are tons of these all across the U.S., and these are mostly open to the public to be able to drive on. The Forest Service, they manage these roads for fire control and for wildlife management, and you can drive out on these things, and there's a number of apps that you can use, or you can get maps from the Forest Service that show you where all these are and where they go to. There's also logging roads. You find some of these in places like Maine and New Hampshire where logging companies, they're actually going out into the woods to be able to bring out timber, and they need a way to get their equipment in and to get their product out. And a lot of these logging roads are also open to the public, and you can drive on these. You find your best scenery on some of these wilderness roads, but you find the best side stops on the back roads and byways. And some of the really odd things, like there was a recent trip a couple of years ago that we took to Asheville area, and we found the International Museum of the House Cat. And that was definitely an oddity, but it was worth the price of admission just for the sheer weirdness of the place. But these are the kinds of things that you find when you kind of get off the main roads and get out there. You can find some really cool stuff to see. So, what kind of places are you staying when you're overlanding? Tons. Do you have to stay at some pristine wilderness spot in order to be an overlander? Well, it's magical when you find them. And a good example of one might be Cape Lookout right here in North Carolina. All you have to do is buy a permit to be able to go out on the beach, and you can drive right out there into this pristine, beautiful seashore area, and to be able to wake up on the beach with a view of the sunrise coming up over the ocean is second to nothing. It's magical. But a lot of the places that you see people on social media camping and these, this beautiful cliff looking out over a canyon, some of this stuff I've found they're staying on private land. Maybe they know the owner of the land, or maybe it's an uncle that has this piece of mountaintop property that they let them stay on. And not all of this stuff is going to be accessible. They were able to find that because they had the hookup for it. But places that you might also stay to be able to piece together an overland route might be state and national park campgrounds. These are coast to coast, and you can find a great way to be able to piece together a route, whether you're going within your state or maybe from state to state. You can stay in these state and national park campgrounds, book those, and it's a great place to stay. Hip camps. Hip camps are also a great way to thread together a route. There's an app called Hip Camp, and it allows people who have private property, maybe they have a scenic mountaintop property that they want to open up to campers. They typically charge a very nominal fee to stay there, and there are some really cool ones out there. You can actually stay at a missile silo out in the Midwest, is one of the hip camps that are out there. You've got BLM lands, the Bureau of Land Management. They maintain an awful lot of land here in the U.S., and typically camping is free on BLM land. There's dispersed camping when you're on the Forest Service roads. You'll see campsites off to the left and right on some of these, and if it's an established campsite that has a fire ring, you can pull in there and you can camp for free. So, how did Susan and I get started in all this? Well, it began on a camping trip. I was trying to get her to go camping with me. And at the time, I had a 2018 Tacoma Sport. And we took our two-man tent and some sleeping bags, sleeping pads, and our assorted gear, threw it into the truck, and I took her on a trip to a place called Scales up in Virginia. The Appalachian Trail runs right through here. I knew it from college. I had been doing my Appalachian Trail sectionals, so I knew about this place, and it's really cool. So we went up there, we set up our camp, and after we had finished dinner, this guy pulls into the camping area, and he has a Forerunner that he had built up into a total overlanding rig. And I had never seen one of these, but he had the rooftop tent, the awnings, all this stuff. And he set up his rig, and I was just blown away. I'd never seen anything like it. But it wasn't until the next morning that we really got bit by the bug, because we had pulled our sleeping bags and our pads out of our tent in order to kind of pack up to head home. And we were still in the process of trying to roll up our sleeping bags and get them into the stuff sacks when we hear an engine fire up. And it was this dude in this Forerunner had already put away his rooftop tent. He'd put away his awnings. He'd put away his chairs and everything. And he was already pulling out of camp. We looked at each other and we're like, we got to get one of those. And that was 3 rooftop tents ago. We're on our 3rd rooftop tent now. We're on our 3rd rig. We also, in addition to the Tacoma that I talked about before, we have had a Jeep JLU, a 2018 JLU, and now we're on a 2021 Tacoma off-road, which has gone itself through a lot of evolution as an overlanding rig. So there's been drawer systems put into the Tacoma. We've got, of course, our rooftop tent, house battery, fridge. There's solar on the roof, and there's a lift kit been put on it because of the weight of the drawer system and the rooftop tent. So it's gone through a significant evolution since we've been using it. But one thing all this equipment does for us is it opens up all 4 seasons. We can camp summer, winter, fall, spring, any time of the year, any kind of an environment that we're going to find ourselves in, we can actually camp in. And if you're thinking this sounds like it's expensive, it has been. It's quite a bit of equipment. However, it might be less than you're thinking. We've gotten rid of more gear than we actually currently use in our setup. We have found that organization is more important than having everything out there. And overlanding is about building a system that actually works for you. So, what's in store with this podcast? Well, I'm going to talk about gear, obviously, like I have been. This pastime can get expensive, particularly if you have no idea what you really need to take with you. It's a bewildering array of equipment out there everybody's trying to sell to us. I'm going to talk about how storage is perhaps the most important part of your rig, aside from recovery gear. And I'm going to talk about both the storage and the recovery gear in other episodes. But I'm also going to talk about how you're going to be able to sort out your needs as you go and your wants. And the wants quickly become an annoyance when you're out there on the road and when you're out here on the trips. So you'll look at a whole bunch of stuff on Amazon and go, "Ooh, I really want that." But the gold is being able to identify what your needs are versus what just looks cool, because you're going to find that some of the stuff that you want quickly, it just gets in the way. It sits in a part of your storage. You get back after a few trips and go, "I never even looked at that thing, let alone took it out," and it gets chucked into a box, and it's kind of like setting money on fire. So being able to figure out what you need versus what you want is going to save you a ton of money trying to do this. I'm also going to talk about places. I'm going to talk about places that Susan and I go, the things that we find along the way on these travels. There's so many interesting places to see in this country. We just got back from a trip up to Maine. We went up the coast of Maine to Acadia and got to go around and experience Acadia for a few days. And that was just a magical trip. And we got to see a lot of cool things, got to eat a lot of cool food, found some of the best lobster rolls I've ever had at this little roadside place that's on the road going into Acadia, and had a blast on that trip, saw some amazing stuff. And you also can meet some of the most interesting people. If you're like me and you're willing to walk up to somebody, anybody, and just strike up a conversation, you get to meet some fascinating people on the travels that you do with your overlanding trips. I'm also going to talk about skills. And what kind of skills? Well, how to get your vehicle out of a stuck situation might be one. And better yet, how to not get your vehicle stuck to begin with. I'm also going to talk about things like how to have a campfire in camp every time. There's nothing more cheerless than having a cold camp and having to crawl into your sleeping bag because you couldn't get a fire lit. How to stay warm when it's cold, cool when it's hot, and dry when it's wet out. I'll talk about things like food, how to get a tasty meal to the table, whether you have a table or not where you're at. But that's an important part to making a good memories and having a good trip out, is to be able to have good food while you're out there. And I'm going to talk about things like how to camp among the wildlife without having to camp with the wildlife. There's going to be lots more that I'm talking about, but I'm drawing on a lifetime that I've spent exploring the outdoors. Everything from doing sectional hikes on the Appalachian Trail when I was in college, to car camping as a kid, to our overlanding adventures over the past 4 years. So, when I talk about overlanding at its soul, what connects all of us overlanders, everybody from the early cross country trekkers in their Model Ts to the safari expeditions that crossed the African continent, to the guys now that are driving from Alaska down to the tip of Argentina and posting their journeys on YouTube, everything that what connects us is a sense of curiosity about this world we live in and a desire to explore it. The point of life is the memories you collect, and to die having stood in amazing places and seen amazing things. And whatever gets you off your couch and out into that world is the very spirit of overlanding. If I can help you get out there on your explorations more comfortably and safely, then that's the point of this podcast. So hit subscribe and join me on this journey to explore this incredible world of ours. I'll see you here next Monday with more on finding your journey right here on the Dirt Road Tourist. Have a great week and go see something amazing.